After decades of welcoming migrants with open arms, Ireland is now fast-tracking deportations, tightening asylum laws, and facing heated protests over immigration centres in small towns. This shift might seem surprising, especially in a nation whose modern identity is rooted in emigration, not exclusion. From the Great Famine in the 1840s through the 1980s, Ireland lost millions of people to other shores. Its population fell from over 8 million to just 2.8 million in a little more than a century. And today, roughly 70 million people worldwide claim Irish heritage. So how did a country built on the pain of departure become one that's closing its doors? Why is Ireland now declaring war on immigration? For most of its existence as an independent nation, immigration wasn't even on the radar. Ireland's problem was the exact opposite. They couldn't keep people from leaving. We're talking about epic levels of emigration here. From the Great Famine of the 1940s through the 1980s, Ireland hemorrhaged people. The population crashed from over 8 million in 1841 to just 2.8 million by 1961. Entire families packed up and left for America, Britain, Australia, anywhere that offered a shot at a better life. This created what we now know as the massive Irish diaspora. That's why today, an estimated 70 million people worldwide claim Irish heritage. Compare that to the 5.1 million actually living in Ireland. That ratio shows how extensively the Irish scattered across the globe. The reasons were almost always the same: money. While the rest of Western Europe modernized and thrived, Ireland stayed stuck. Poor, rural, and with few prospects, young people felt like they had no real choice but to leave. Farewell parties, known as American wakes, became part of the culture. They were full of tears and final hugs, because leaving often meant never coming back. And I'm telling you this because it matters for understanding what happened next. Over time, Ireland became a country shaped not by those who arrived, but by those who left. Emigration was in the national DNA. People grew up knowing what it meant to say goodbye, to land somewhere unfamiliar with nothing but grit and hope. That collective memory fostered a kind of quiet understanding, an empathy for migrants that would shape how Ireland later handled immigration. Still, even into the 1980s, the country kept losing people. Economic recession hit hard, and over 200,000 people left, most of them young and educated, chasing futures that didn't exist at home. The cycle felt endless. Then came the 1990s, and almost overnight, everything changed. The Celtic Tiger economic boom flipped Ireland's story on its head. In just 15 years, it went from one of Europe's poorest countries to one of its wealthiest. EU membership brought in waves of foreign investment, multinational companies set up shop, and for the first time in a long time, there were jobs, and plenty of them. People stopped leaving. In fact, they started coming back. The immigrant generation returned with experience, skills, and savings, but they weren't the only ones arriving. The real turning point came in 2004, when the EU expanded eastward. While most countries worried about being overrun by cheap labor from places like Poland, Latvia, or Lithuania and impose restrictions, Ireland went the other way. Along with the UK and Sweden, it's opened the doors wide. No limits, no delays. Just come in. We need you. It was idealistic, sure, but also deeply practical. Ireland believed in the European project and the freedom to move. But let's be real, they also had a labor shortage. Construction, healthcare, hospitality, factories, every industry needed people, fast. So the response was bigger than anyone expected. Immigration hit a peak of over 150,000 new arrivals in 2007. Polish became the third national language, after English and Irish. Walk down the street in any Irish town, and you'd hear Lithuanian, Latvian, or Romanian like it was always part of the soundscape. By 2022, 1 in 5 people living in Ireland had been born elsewhere. That's over 1 million immigrants in a country of just 5.1 million. To put it in perspective, that's a higher share of foreign-born residents than the United States, a country that built its entire identity around immigration. And here's where the whole thing really starts heating up. But first, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, as it helps the channel more than you think. Now, back to the video. For years, asylum applications to Ireland remained pretty manageable. We're talking modest numbers that the system could handle without breaking a sweat. In 2014, there were just 1,448 applications. The numbers crept up gradually: 2,244 in 2017, 3,673 in 2018, 4,781 in 2019, but nothing that screamed crisis. Then COVID-19 hit and temporarily disrupted everything. Travel restrictions meant asylum applications actually dropped: 1,567 in 2020, 2,659 in 2021. Irish officials probably thought they'd caught a break, maybe even had time to strengthen their systems for whatever came next. They had no idea what was coming. The post-pandemic immigration wave hit Ireland like nothing before. In 2022, asylum applications skyrocketed to over 13,600, a staggering 413% jump from the year before. And it didn't stop there. 2023 held steady with over 13,000 more, keeping the system under pressure. Then 2024 broke every previous record, nearly 18,600 applications. Just 3 years earlier, the number hadn't even cracked 3,000. And it wasn't just the volume, it was the pace. Ireland suddenly had one of the highest asylum application rates in Europe relative to its population, about 3.4 per 1,000 residents. That's more than Germany, France, or Italy, countries far larger and with more established systems to handle this kind of flow. But who was coming? Because that changed too. In 2024, Nigeria jumped to the top of the list, making up nearly a quarter of all asylum claims. That's a massive surge, more than 4 times the number from the previous year. In just the first 8 months of 2024, over 3,300 Nigerians applied for asylum. Other top countries included Algeria, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Georgia. Georgia's case is especially telling. Ireland labelled it a safe country back in 2018, which means applications should be quickly processed and mostly denied. But year after year, Georgians kept coming, suggesting that Ireland's deterrent policies weren't really working as intended. And then there's Ukraine. Since Russia's invasion in early 2022, nearly 105,000 Ukrainians have arrived in Ireland. Unlike other asylum seekers, they were granted special protections under EU rules, access to accommodation and full welfare payments, about €222 per week. Compare that to the €38.80 given to everyone else. The result? A two-tier system that created real political strain. The Ukrainians, understandably fleeing a brutal war, got strong support. But others, escaping violence, poverty, or persecution in Africa and the Middle East, were left with scraps. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Another thing impossible to ignore was how people were actually getting into the country. For years, most asylum seekers arrived through Dublin Airport without proper documents. It wasn't ideal, but at least it was predictable. Easy to monitor, easy to process. But in 2024, that flipped. Most people were now applying for asylum directly at the International Protection Office in the city centre, not at airports or ferry terminals, which meant that they were already inside of the country by the time they applied. That pointed to one likely route, through Northern Ireland. The common travel area between Ireland and the UK was built to let Irish and British citizens move freely. It was never designed for asylum seekers to use it as a backdoor into the EU. Former Justice Minister Helen McEntee even claimed that over 80% of new asylum seekers were arriving via Northern Ireland. That's how serious the shift was. Ireland's post-Brexit position, still in the EU but sharing an open land border with the UK, had created a migration puzzle no one was ready for. In one 4-day stretch in May 2024, Gardaí, or the National Police and Security Service of the Republic of Ireland, caught 50 people trying to cross illegally from the UK. By May 20th, they'd flagged 107 people without valid visas in targeted checks. The numbers might sound small, but they marked something new, a kind of unauthorized entry that Ireland hadn't really seen before. And now the once invisible border, so central to peace and cooperation, was quietly becoming a pressure point in the immigration debate. So, how did Ireland go from decades of relatively successful immigration policy to a complete system overload almost overnight? It wasn't one thing, it was a perfect storm. Multiple crises colliding at the worst possible time. It all starts with housing, and to be fair, this one was already out of control long before asylum numbers spiked. Ireland is short at least 212,000 homes, maybe more. Over 40% of young adults between 18 and 34 still live with their parents, not because they want to, but because they simply can't afford to move out. In Dublin, rents have doubled since 2010. It's now one of the most expensive cities in Europe to live in. Now, let's say you're a young Irish person stuck at home, watching the government convert hotels and offices into emergency housing for refugees. Even if you're compassionate, even if you understand why people are fleeing their countries, that kind of contrast becomes politically explosive. When your own housing needs go unmet, it's hard to watch new arrivals get placed into housing immediately. The system itself buckled. In 2021, Ireland was housing around 7,000 asylum seekers. Manageable. But by late 2023, that number had exploded to over 32,000. IPAS, the agency in charge, was scrambling. They were booking up every hotel, repurposing buildings, cutting emergency deals just to keep people off the street. Small towns felt the shock most. Places with little to no experience handling large-scale immigration suddenly found themselves dealing with hundreds of asylum seekers arriving overnight. Roscrea, a quiet town in Tipperary with a population of just 5,500, saw its only hotel converted into a refugee center holding 500 people. No warning, no preparation, just impact. The cost? Massive. By 2023, it was costing the government €84 per asylum seeker per day, over €30,000 per person per year. Multiply that by the tens of thousands, and you're talking hundreds of millions. Critics argued that the money should have been used to fix the housing crisis for citizens, but the problem ran deeper than budgets. Ireland's asylum system just wasn't built for this. Decisions that should have taken months dragged on for years. Some people waited over 5 years just to find out if they could stay. That kind of limbo takes a toll on individuals, on communities, and on trust in the system. Then came November 2023. A horrific stabbing outside a school in Dublin injured several children and their teacher. Within hours, rumors started circulating online, claiming the attacker was an immigrant. The police urged the public not to jump to conclusions, but it was already too late. Far-right groups, many linked to international extremist networks, seized the moment. What began as a protest in Dublin turned into chaos. Riots, burning buses, looted shops, and here's the detail that made it clear: hotels housing migrants were deliberately targeted. That night exposed something deeper. For months, social media had been a breeding ground for conspiracy theories about asylum seekers. Phrases like "Ireland is full" and "House the Irish first" weren't fringe anymore, they were trending. Public opinion was shifting fast. A Red C poll in mid-2023 showed that 75% of people believed Ireland had taken too many refugees. That number stunned even veteran political analysts. The idea that Ireland's own history of emigration would naturally lead to compassion, that assumption was starting to crack. By the end of 2024, it wasn't just about opinions, it was becoming political. One poll showed that 28% of voters would now consider backing a party with strong anti-immigration views. That's double the figure from just 3 years earlier, in a country where anti-immigration rhetoric used to be fringe, was seen as a major shift. Throughout its history, Ireland hasn't exactly been known for sudden political shifts. This is a country where change usually takes time, but in late 2023 and into 2024, everything about Ireland's approach to immigration flipped fast. And for a country long praised for its humanitarian stance, the changes were not just unexpected, they were radical. It all started in December 2023. The government announced that Ireland could no longer guarantee housing for everyone seeking asylum. That was a first. Suddenly, not everyone was entitled to a bed. Single men in particular were left out. Women, children, and the most vulnerable still had priority, but the rest? They were on their own. As a result, tent cities began appearing across Dublin. Parks turned into makeshift camps, and the imagery of people sleeping rough outside the International Protection Office became a global embarrassment for a nation that had once taken pride in its compassion. Still, the government didn't blink. They pressed forward with a new, harder line. Deportations were ramped up like never before. Cross from Northern Ireland without permission, you could be expelled the same day. In 2024 alone, deportation orders jumped 156%, a number that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier. Meanwhile, Ireland broadened its list of so-called safe countries. Georgia, Albania, South Africa, and several Balkan nations made the cut. That meant applicants from these countries could be rejected in weeks, not months. It was efficient, sure, but critics pointed out that some of those places weren't exactly safe for everyone, especially minorities and political dissidents. Even Ukrainians, who had once been welcomed with open arms, saw their support slashed. From open-ended stays and full welfare rates, they were suddenly told they had 90 days in state housing and just €38.80 a week to live on. The rule applied retroactively to those already living in Ireland, many of whom had begun to settle into new lives. All of this unfolded alongside a political earthquake. For the first time, far-right candidates gained seats in local elections. Anti-immigration independents made gains, especially in areas where refugee centers had opened without local input. And the mainstream parties took notice fast. Even Sinn Féin, historically pro-migrant, began calling for tougher controls. Then immigration checks returned to the Northern Ireland border, something unthinkable just a few years ago, given the sensitivity of the peace process. Gardaí patrolled rural roads, coordinated with bus drivers, and checked IDs. The open, seamless border started to feel a lot less open. And yet, through all the fear and anger, there's one thing no one really wants to talk about. Ireland needs immigrants, desperately. From hospitals and tech firms to farms and construction sites, foreign workers keep the economy running. They pay taxes, fill critical gaps, and often use fewer public services than locals. But the rising cost of housing asylum seekers and a brutal housing crisis has made the politics almost impossible. That leaves Ireland trapped between the economic need for immigration and the growing public backlash against it. But not everyone agrees. Recently, Conor McGregor, one of the biggest names to ever fight in the UFC, has become a vocal critic of Ireland's immigration policies and has publicly expressed his intention to run for the Irish presidency, focusing on an anti-immigration platform. However, he faces several obstacles to becoming a candidate, including the need for a specific number of nominations from Irish Parliament members or local councils, which he has not secured. Many Irish politicians have publicly rejected his potential candidacy. Such an awkward spot to be in. Now you know why Ireland is suddenly cracking down on immigration. So, give the video a like, subscribe for more content, and check out this video YouTube thinks you'll love. Thank you for watching.